both muscles. But you might have more success if you think about, within the functional task that you're trying to change, how is that muscle normally incorporated? What else is going on? Where would the patient be achieving their stability for that movement? So if you're goal-orientated, say, to improve swing phase of gait, right, where would the patient in the swing phase of the left leg, where would they be achieving stability, right? Is it in their contralateral shoulder girdle? How important is that diagonal? Is it within the pelvis or the musculature of the vertebral column that holds the deep musculature that holds the vertebral column stable? Right? In going for selective hip flexion, does the hip flexor, is it the only muscle that comes on? No. Is there an inability to get the concentric hip flexion because they haven't got the graded stabilizing activity of the hip extensors to let the leg go forward, almost like the rope giving out to allow the movement? Right? So think not just about the one muscle, but think in terms of a bigger picture, because that's how the central nervous system produces movement. And the other quick message is to say that walking in normality, and I think all of us working, this is probably, although maybe I'm incorrect to say, but I was going to say probably truer for the neurologically impaired patient, that loses the automaticity of walking. They lose the ability to walk and talk, to walk and take their jacket off, to walk and think about dinner, right? So you see them stop to talk. You see them stop and sit down to take the jacket off. But in normalcy, walking's a dual control activity. We have the ability to walk and perform a higher cognitive executive function at the same time. As you lose the skill of walking, you know, think of the elderly maybe, or possibly post, you know, orthopedic injury, you lose the skill of walking. You have to put more cortical attention towards it. Right? There's a really nice article by Paul Ada looking at trying to find a way of measuring automaticity. Right? So can you walk and do mathematics at the same time? Because that's the essence of what we should as humans be able to do. Okay, so locomotion. This is a lovely quote which I will let you read in terms of the big picture of locomotion. So the human infant faces a daunting task. To walk, we must generate locomotor pattern, generate force, modulate the change in center of gravity, coordinate the limbs, adapt to changing conditions, change joint positions, and coordinate all kinds of incoming visual, auditory, vestibular, and peripheral information. And we must do that within the properties of the muscles that we've got attached to our central nervous system. And all that has to be done within milliseconds and in coordination with many other body functions and movements. So it's a huge, you know, I think one of the things I'd say, going back to the invitation to combine ortho and neuro and talk about gait, it's a huge topic. If you're interested in one article to read after this, this is the one I would suggest. So Grillner 2008, it's really nice and recent. It's only about 6 pages long. It's very concise, it's very well written, and it gives you the big picture. And this is a picture from it. So it's really putting forward the components of the central nervous system that are involved in goal-directed locomotion. So we have a basal ganglia that receives input from thalamus and cortex, and that allows for selection of the motor program. Right? Remember that being one theory of motor control. It then sends a message down to the brainstem, where the midbrain locomotor region commands us to walk. It then communicates to another aspect of the brainstem, the reticular formation, and through the reticular spinal system, descending tract, turns on the central pattern generators within the spinal cord that produce the rhythmical activity of locomotion. that rhythmical activity can be adapted based on sensory feedback. So it's not hardwired, it can be adapted. And in a way, if you want to go to sleep now, that's the guts of it. That's the really nice summary of all the parts of the central nervous system and their roles in producing locomotion. Rather than talk through each of those pieces, which is actually what the article does, I'm going to speak to it in terms of the requirements, right? Because I think that it's almost more of a functional perspective rather than looking at pieces of anatomy. So the first requirement is a pattern, right? Pattern is created by central pattern generators. Is that terminology that many of you are comfortable with, or is that there's some nodding heads and then some no? So central pattern generators are defined as neuronal circuits that produce the patterned, coordinated, rhythmic movement that underpins breathing, chewing, swimming, walking, flying, even when it's cut off from the brain and the sensory input. Right? So it's circuitry that can be dissected out and of its own produce patterned, rhythmical movement patterns to allow us as humans to walk. It's a subgroup of motor programs. The circuitry is complex, but the essence of it is very simple, really. So this diagram up here is looking at a lamprey, and a lamprey is a favourite animal for studying the central pattern generators, because a lamprey, I think it lives in the ocean. I don't know if it's ocean or freshwater, but all the lamprey does is this. It's like the snake, right? Except it's a little bit less venomous. And I think it's a lot smaller. And so they can take lamprey and look at it, and they have these mutually inhibiting flexor and extensor half circles. So one side's bent, one side's flexing, the other side's shortened. Then it changes. Then it changes. Then it changes. Right? And that's the essence of the rhythm of the change between flexion and extension activity in our limbs as we move. It's clever, really, isn't it? Because all the brain has to do is say, I'd like that program. It doesn't have to say, oh, I don't want to sound too simple. It just has to say, I'd like that program, but I'm going to change it a little bit for this environment. All right. Now, this looks complicated, but I think this is a clear way of explaining something that was explained to me about 10 times before I even vaguely started to get it. One of the odd things about the central nervous system and how we're wired is often the central nervous system allows something to happen because we turn off something that was already turned off. Right? So, and that's a really complicated thing to get in your head when you first start hearing neurophysiology lectures. And we call it disinhibition. So we give it a whole new name that I sat there and thought, well, I'm obviously meant to know what that means, but I haven't got a clue. But so often, instead of saying, I want you to do something, so instead of saying, spinal cord, make the central pattern generators turn on, we turn off something that normally keeps them turned off. And therefore, they're on. Right? And that's really what this diagram's about. It's saying that in normality, these blue things, blue's is inhibition and red's excitation, and striatum is the basal ganglia. So the striatum is the input to the basal ganglia, and the pallidum's the output. And again, it's in that article, and it's really clearly written in that article. So at rest, the pallidum